Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, head over to iTunes or to Google Play and give us a rating and a comment. In this episode, we're going to talk about haunted houses in RPGs. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix.
I'm Jason.
I'm Adam.
And I'm usually Dave from the Digital Soup Podcast.
A proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other podcasts
At GonnaGeek.com and get ready because geekiness begins in 3,
2.
1.
Welcome to an episode. Welcome to Just One More Fix. Couple quick announcements. As you heard, our Patreon should be going live October 20th. We're finishing and finalizing the last details of it as we speak. So look for that on October 20th, like I said, and hopefully you guys can show us some love and support the show on Patreon. Again, this is Horror Month. We are doing all themed episodes. We are recording our review of Bluebeard's Bride in the next couple days, hopefully this weekend. So that'll be coming out. And
hopefully. We are doing it. Stop
well,
saying
yeah,
hopefully.
okay. But hopefully we're recording it this weekend is what I'm saying. We're going to record it no matter what, but was hoping to get it done this weekend and then sent out to you guys soon. Yeah. And we'll have one more horror-themed episode this month.
I'm sad that it's ending.
Me too. Well,
we should also do one the first Wednesday of November.
It is All Souls Day, so we could totally do that as well. Although we'll be recording that episode in October, so it might have to qualify. Right on. And the final announcement is we're working on some other interviews with some RPG game designers and that kind of stuff to come on the show and talk about their games. And hopefully those will pan out and we will have those sometime in the near future. This episode was your idea, so do you want to intro this one?
It was my idea?
Yeah.
Oh, hey. Apparently this is my idea. Okay, so you can't really talk about horror without talking about The Haunted House. It's kind of a classic.
Right. You
see it in, movies, films, whatever. We're all recreating it at our gaming table in some form or another already. Yeah, it informs some of my favorite stories. So I feel like we should talk about it.
Right on.
And that is what we are going to do.
I thought we might start off with some of our favorite inspiration for horror, or for not for horror, but for haunted house stories specifically. Do you just want to go back and forth here? I've got several, I think.
Okay, well, I'll go first.
Right on.
With my absolute favorite, The Haunting. Not the new version, the old 1960s version.
Yeah, black and white.
Black and white. Amazing.
And to be fair, the new one it's not bad, but it's just not quite as good as the original, I think.
It's really not. And the original stands up.
Yeah, it does.
Like it's not hokey or cheesy. It is very well done.
If I remember right, they use a lot of the kind of the Hitchcock feel where you don't really see the, like what's happening, a lot of off-camera stuff.
There's a lot of angles. How they do the rooms in a lot of the scenes are kind of designed to induce sort of a closed-in feeling. And then there's a scene, I think, where the walls are moving or breathing. It's been a long time since I've watched it, but I remember being just like, oh my gosh, that looks real, like even now. So well done. And it does a great job with the concept of isolation, which I think is very interesting because you have a giant mansion and yet you still feel closed off and alone.
Right. So hold up there because we're going to talk about before we go too deep into that, because we're going to talk about some tropes and things that what makes the haunted house genre what it is. You went with an old one, so I'll go with one of my older ones as well, which is I think the classic one that a lot of people think of, which is The Shining. And while Stephen King didn't like it because it doesn't exactly come across the way his book does, because Jack Nicholson, in his view, went a little too crazy, a little too fast, but I think Jack Nicholson just comes off as a little crazy, a little fast in every movie that he plays in. But there's just a whole lot of creepiness in that movie again, isolation being a big part of it. And that's a big theme with these haunted house movies and stuff. And it has this, I don't know if it's even gotten scarier because it has kind of this retro 70s, 60s look to it, you know?
Mhm.
And it's just odd and creepy. And there's all kinds of just bad, terrible stuff that happens in it. Do you have a newer one?
Well, newer than 1960. Hold on. I want to make sure I don't mess up the name of it. Yes, there it is. Okay. So this one is actually a comedy horror movie, and it is just called House.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
In this one, it's a guy who's a writer who's lost his son, and he's trying to write a novel about being in the Vietnam War with his old training buddy. And it's got, I don't know that, it's just very hokey.
Yeah.
And it was meant to be that way. It wasn't supposed to be like super, super serious or whatever. It wasn't like, Plan 9 from Outer Space where they sat down to make a serious sci-fi movie and was like, oh no, what happened?
Right.
It involves a lot of the same concepts. The setting is the same, and a lot of the same plot points occur as in The Haunting,
Right.
but the feel is
Drastically
completely
different.
different.
That is something about a lot of these, is a lot of them, because they are all haunted house movies, all have a lot of the same kind of tropes and setups, I guess you might say.
Well, and when you're thinking about like RPG games, if you're wanting to run like an RPG game for maybe some kids at the table, you can still do the haunted house, but
Yeah.
in more of this kind of a theme, or more of a, I hope this is not on your list, but Scooby-Doo
No, that's
sort
one
of theme.
Yeah, one to mention is Scooby-Doo is a great one to draw inspiration from. Now, granted, if you're running for kids, you can take direct inspiration from that. But if you're running for adults, there's still a lot to mine there, because like, I would like to pretend that my games are as sophisticated as Shakespeare, but let's be honest, they're not. And I think if you just take those basic plot elements and allow the players to add drama and your description of things to add ambiance and atmosphere, that should take care of all of it right there. I would just eliminate the part where it's like, and I'd have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you darn kids, that, just take that part away and I think you're good. All right, I've got a couple newer ones here that I'm going to go with, and I know one of them is one of your favorites, and I think you've probably forgotten about it, just didn't realize it. So
I already know what you're going to say, but go ahead.
One of them mentioned is 13 Ghosts, and this is a remake, but I'm talking about the newer one.
Mhm.
And it is really, there's a lot. It's kind of like one part creature flick and one part haunted house, because the house is an actual character in the movie. And that's kind of how I decide when it's a haunted house movie, is when the house, the setting, almost becomes its own character, right? And there's a lot of moving pieces and the walls slide and all this kind of stuff. And
The puzzle box and organization behind it gives it a very similar feel to The Cabin in the Woods
yes.
that came out not that long ago
Yeah.
as well.
I just wrote that one down. It just occurred to me a minute ago. That's a great one. Just Cabin in the Woods is a great movie if you want to see horror tropes so blaringly obvious. Like they're like punching you in the face with them in that movie. So if you don't know how to do horror, that's actually a really good one to watch. I never even thought of that, because they spell it out for you exactly. Like literally say this
They
is...
give you the character archetypes,
Yeah.
and then they give you potential different settings.
Right. It's such a great movie. I don't want to say too much about that one if you haven't seen it, because that's a pretty big spoiler movie. So it's definitely worth watching if you haven't seen it. But so 13 Ghosts, Paranormal Activity. The first one specifically is very interesting to look at in terms of mining things for inspiration, because the premise of it is very mundane. There's not a lot of special effects that happen in the movie. It's all very kind of low budget and easy effects, I guess. And I think...
The whole thing is basically shot by security cameras.
Yeah. Well, but like the way things are done and the moments where there are scares are very simple and basic techniques. And I think to look at that, see how effective it is a great way to look at the simplicity of that and pull that into an RPG, because you don't have to have like this big budget thing and all this largeness and over the top things happening to have an effective horror movie or horror game in any way, horror story. The other one I'm going to mention here is The Woman in Black, which was on Netflix for quite a while.
Oh my gosh.
And
that
it
was so
has
good.
Daniel Radcliffe in it. That's the one. Was that the one you were thinking I was going to
It
mention?
was not.
Oh, really? That's one of my favorite ones now in terms of haunted house movies. It's really, really good. I really like Daniel Radcliffe. He does a great job in a lot of stuff. And that's just a really creepy, great movie. What was the one you were thinking of?
I thought you were going to say The Babadook.
Oh,
Which
I thought about
isn't
that, but it's not quite a haunted house.
No,
yeah,
it's more.
that's more of a
Is this
creature
single
flick.
creature.
Yeah, I agree because it's
It
not
falls in the
about,
Ring category for me. Like,
Yeah, because that one's more
or
about
Hellraiser.
the creature.
Here's a thing that you
Yeah.
summon, and now you're haunted by
Mhm.
it, as opposed to.
and it goes anywhere, not just about the location of the house. Amityville Horror is another great one, and the new one is a very, very good remake as well. There's a lot of creepy
That's
stuff in that.
demon possession there.
Yeah.
So I would say that falls in the same category with The Shining or Poltergeist.
Mhm.
Probably falls in that category
Poltergeist is on my list as well. And season 1 of the American Horror Story is a great example. It is literally a
Yes.
haunted house. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And there's a lot of different characters and storylines going on in that one. So that's kind of a good example of something with some more complex character development and an ongoing story that's episodic as opposed to like a classic horror one shot, which is what a lot of these movies kind of turn things into. So I think there's a lot of different ideas and ways to go about things if you have a sort of a one shot self contained story versus a series like American Horror Story.
Right. And with that one, you see an interesting thing that isn't in a lot of the other ones that we mentioned, in that it's not a single individual haunting the house. It is similar to Poltergeist, where the location is just evil.
Right.
But in this storyline, you get an introduction of several different characters
Mhm.
that are haunting the house, and they're not all evil either, which is interesting.
Right. And that's something we'll touch on when we get to tropes. That's very, very important. So in my mind, we're going to kind of break some of these haunted houses down into a couple different categories. One of them is kind of like the Poltergeist thing, where like something it's on bad ground, right? Poltergeist, it's on an I think
It's an Indian burial ground.
right, and they built
I
a house
believe.
on top of it, so the spirits there are restless and upset because they've desecrated their graveyard.
However, it is not a single isolated spirit. So it's
right,
not like
several.
whatever Bob haunts this house.
Right.
It's this house is just haunted,
Haunted.
by a malevolent presence,
Right.
and it's unspecified.
13 Ghosts is kind of the work of a madman. So there's been a person who's gathered all this stuff or done rituals or something to call evil to this house and lock it there.
This very naturally lends itself to a Cthulhu mythos
Yes.
very easily.
Yeah, very easily. Actually, all these do, but that one works because of the classic cultist thing. They're
Mhm.
trying to harness the power of these bad guys. The Amityville Horror kind of goes along with, well, I guess this one is a little, I guess I'm thinking of the actual story that inspired it, but some of these horror
It's more of
stories,
a devil possession story.
right, that's a possession story, but some of the
but-
other ones have where there's a terrible accident or something bad has happened there, like several murders. There's been terrible, terrible things that have happened there, and this energy has creeped into the house, and it is still there, sort of possessing the house and wanting to bring out more evil.
Right.
And I think that's pretty much the basis of where most of them, like there's some ways to tweak it and things, but that's pretty much the basis of it. So either it's unconsecrated ground, essentially, where something bad has happened, where you've disturbed the ground or the spirits there. A madman is creating all kinds of problems and locking ghosts away or summoning demons there. An actual demon-possessed house, or murders and bad juju, bad energy is stuck in a house because of things that have happened there. Was that fair to say, you think? Is there anything else you can think of besides those ones there?
I think those are the basics.
Right on. All right, so before we get into tropes, mentioning those three there, right? I think it's important to think about when you look at a haunted house in all these movies, everything that is happening in the movie or in the story, if you're in terms of reading a book or a graphic novel, because there's lots of sources of great inspiration, all the things that happen in terms of what's happening to the characters in the stories are built around the reason why the house is haunted, and they all point back towards that. So the characters never know exactly why the house is haunted, right?
Mhm.
But everything that happens keeps pointing in small ways back to the reason for the haunting.
Right.
Now, you don't have to be super ham-fisted about it and say it's a demon-possessed house and now there's little devils running around the place, right? I think that's a little over the top right out of the gate, right? Maybe some doors are slamming or whatever. There's some weird occurrences, but it should all sort of point to the reason why there's a haunting. And then you should sort of tweak your themes and what you're doing to point towards that. So give them evil themes or demonic themes or whatever, if that's your case.
It's kind of an exaggerated intro into your game, but it's been used over and over and over again in countless movies. I'm a wealthy aristocrat who has inherited this house, and I want your team to go and investigate it.
Right.
Because you have whatever set of skills that makes you qualified to make that happen, be it paranormal, psychic skills, or what have you.
Right.
And now you're investigating this house for me, and that's why you're all there together.
Or you could be complete mundane investigators, and maybe it's a couple that bought the house, and one side of the couple thought it was supernatural, so she hired supernatural investigators to come in and confirm the haunting. But the other side of the couple thinks, oh, they were quacks and just trying to steal our money. I'm hiring real investigators to come in here. So then how do you reconcile all these sort of supernatural things happening while you're trying to find a mundane reason for them, right? That could be a fun game.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about some tropes and some common things that happen in almost all of these movies, right? So the first piece of it is that initially no one believes it's actually haunted. And I don't know if that's directly you have to bring that into the RPG world, because I think you can just lead with this house is haunted, right? But there's always a majority of people seem to think that no, this place isn't haunted and it's no big deal. And then there's someone who is innocent or children that always start to see the bad stuff happen, but no one believes them.
Or you can have the exact opposite of that. Everyone firmly believes the house is haunted and your group is skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like I said, whatever wealthy businessman has bought this place and he wants you to check it out and disprove that it is.
Right.
You know, basically local superstition versus logic.
Mm-hmm. So some of these, there's just a lot of, in terms of what makes the movie or whatever scary, is all these little phenomenon that happen. And in the beginning, the phenomena start off small, right? So it's maybe I hear footsteps upstairs, but there's no one else up there. So we go look and there's nobody there. Oh, whatever. It just seems kind of odd. Doors slam.
It has to start with basic things that you could logically explain away.
Right.
If you really wanted to. Like, like denial has to be able to override in the beginning, at least.
So the footsteps is a good one. Doors slamming, lights flickering on and off seems to always be a piece of this if you're in an electrical age.
Any kind of unexplained breezes, like these papers ruffle, the curtains move.
Right. Cold chills, a pencil rolls across a table, things fall off the counter. Those things, they sometimes maybe you don't see them happen. You know, I set things down, I leave, I come back, and now it's somewhere else. You know, that's always kind of creepy. And a lot of this, if you have friends that have had some kind of weird experiences in their own houses, everybody seems to have some kind of a story where things used to go missing all the time and turn up in weird places, or they used to hear things or see things or whatever. Those are all great things to pull on as well.
And don't be afraid to go with non-physically tangible things. Just a general feeling of unease or unrest does a fine job as well.
That temperature drop thing is very common and an easy, cool one to use. That it's just there are cold spots in the house, or this place just feels creepy. It feels like someone is watching you right now. And everybody's felt that. You know, you walk into this weird, creepy basement, whether you want to believe in any of that stuff or not, you're just like, ugh, this place gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Your brain going,
you shouldn't be in here right now.
I watched this movie once.
Right. All right. Some of the other things, we mentioned things falling. One of my favorite things is when they make water run backwards. I don't know why. It's always like these kind of weird, creepy moments where these like this time lapse kind of moment happens, right? And the water, instead of pouring out of an overflowing sink, is like going back up into it. Like maybe the time goes forwards and then backwards.
Right.
And there's these kind of weird, non-linear time frames. And then also, it happens in 13 Ghosts a whole lot, where what they are seeing is actually two different things. So in one scene, he's seeing the sink is overflowing with water, and then the camera kind of does this shutter thing, and then it turns out it's blood now, and there's blood all over the place, and written on the walls in blood, and then it goes back, kind of like these weird flashback moments, right? Those are always great to use and fun to be able to foreshadow with things where you're starting to play with someone's mind, and maybe they start to become a little unhinged, because that is another trope, is that it's generally a male character, like the father figure kind of loses it and goes unhinged. And this happens in Amityville Horror. And it's kind of like, was he always crazy? Mm-hmm. Or is he just really crazy now? You know, there's
The
this kind of-
Shining, The House, all of those. And actually, it happens in The Haunting as well, but you don't see it with a father figure. Now you see it with this girl who's a little quirky anyway. So you can have either that strong character or the one who's kind of on the edge. And again, that's the denial. So, you know, the rest of the group thinks maybe she's just crazy. She was a little off anyway.
Right. Something else that's cool is to use those classic, what do you call it? The secret bookcase. Pull the special book and the bookcase swings away, and all those kind of classic, hokey isn't really the right word, I don't feel like sometimes, because it's almost like expected. In like some of these horror genre pieces, it's like that's what adds the flavor and the feel of it, and everybody kind of expects it to happen.
Well, I think when you're talking about the haunted house, you need to have a location that is a little bit mundanely mysterious also. And those add those elements. It's like nobody wants to go to the haunted duplex, right? Like
Right.
this place needs to be interesting and it needs to have character on its own. And then you're adding these other layers of things on top of that as well.
Right. Well, you mentioned like the physicality of the building. So many of them have this family that buys an old fixer-upper, right? That is a huge house, but we got a great deal on it, and we're gonna fix it up, and it's gonna be great. It's gonna be ours. Amityville Horror is that. There's so many of them that are that
in and
way.
of itself is interesting because you're starting off with your sort of everyman story.
Right.
So you started off with characters that are instantly relatable to the common person. You
Right.
know, we've all had that struggle like, okay, you know, money is tight. So
Yeah.
we bought this place to try and save some money. And now we're going to fix it up. And generally you have a family there too. So then you're even more in a way like emotionally invested because that implies a level of goodness. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
you don't expect terrible family unless you're watching like House of a Thousand Corpses. Like generally
Well,
it's the nice family.
Something else it does is it means that they can't just walk away from the house. They've invested a lot of money into it. While it's not the best house in condition, it's the biggest house in this great place. Maybe it's run down, but I can't just walk away from it now, right?
And that's exactly what you have in the story from the first season of American Horror Story.
Right.
And again, if you're looking at lighthearted children's RPGs, you also have this in the movie Casper. You have it in the movie, what's the one with Eddie Murphy, where he goes there with his family?
I can't. Haunted Mansion.
I believe that's what it's called. Yeah, the Haunted
I thought about
Mansion.
putting that one in here, but I couldn't remember the name of it. But yes, that's a great example. Actually, that's a really good example of one to use in terms of doing something that isn't so terribly scary. Another thing is that a common for haunted houses where it's actually a home is this big fancy house is another big trope of it. If you think of 13 Ghosts, that's what it is. Haunted Mansion with Eddie Murphy, that one is a giant, amazing home and sort of this older opulence, early 1900s, 1920s, everything's so big. The woodwork is all amazing and carved, and it just has this age and mystery to it a little bit.
The Woman in Black is like that as well, which interestingly, that trope of I work for a lawyer, I'm going to assess this house is exactly the same starting theme you have for the book Dracula.
Oh, I never even thought of that. That's really cool. So I don't want to spoil that movie for anybody, but we'll talk about that one because
It's a horror movie. It ends badly.
Yeah, well,
As they do.
Let's just move into Isolation. That's my favorite one, I think, for Isolation because it's a newer movie and it kind of takes a different perspective on it. Because so Daniel Radcliffe's character gets sent to this house to assess it, essentially, right? Because someone has died. And it is in the middle of nowhere, and like it's in the middle of a bog in Scotland. Is that right?
Could be.
Somewhere in northern England.
Feels right enough.
Either way. So not only is it isolated in that no one else is there with him, it is physically isolated from everything. There's nothing around. If I remember right, the
There
area
is a-
floods around it and you can't get in or out all the time.
There is a small town, but they even do a good job of isolating him within that town as well because it's a rural area and he is an outsider.
And I believe he's also like English and they don't like him
Yeah.
because of that. And he's a lawyer or an assessor. So isolation is a big piece of all of these because if you go into a house and things go bad and you can just walk away, well, you've lost the entire story. You have to have a reason to keep everybody there.
And
so
even though you're playing a horror game and that's what everybody's sitting down to, you see in the beginning of all these stories where there is some kind of NPC minor character that's planting the seed of doubt
right.
in your characters. So you see this when he's setting up shop at this local town and he's asking someone to drive him out there, and they get kind of this him-haw thing. He ends up in a car with somebody who's driving him out there, and he kind of says, are you sure you want to be out there?
Right.
Basically that place is bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that same character again and again and again in these stories where they're going, and here's a little bit of doubt about what you're doing.
So like the caretaker of the property,
Right.
Yeah. You kind of mentioned the caretaker saying, "Oh, are you sure you want to be out there? Are you sure you want to do this?" And we talked about how the phenomenon starts off slow at the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to keep in mind that these are slow burn kind of stories, right? They slowly build, and it's something to be cognizant of because you don't want to just go right at them 100% with this style of game. This is a thing where the tension grows slowly, and then when the climax happens, then all hell breaks loose, right? But you've got to kind of build that anxiety and tension slowly. If you think of it in terms of like a creature flick, right? A lot of times there's a little bit of buildup, and then the creature attacks. And then that part of the movie is the main part, is the creature attacking, right? Whereas this is the exact opposite. It's a whole lot of buildup, and then things go off the rails. 100%. I should say 100% off the rails. But there's always this slow building. So each event that happens continues to build a little bit more until things really go crazy. But it is a slower burn style of a game. Now
you can do it with a one shot and still do kind of a hard off the rails thing, which
even in a one shot, I'm saying
we did one in like a 3-hour period, but yeah, right. it's a slow build and then sudden crashing, descending doom. But if you wanted to do something like this over multiple sessions, there are, like, the American Horror Story plays out over several individual shows to the season climax, and Stephen King's the miniseries Rose Red that was based on his story,
yes, was
done, I think, over like maybe 5 or 6, maybe. I don't remember. It's been a long time. But it was, instead of doing a full-length movie, they did a miniseries. Mm-hmm. And that is a very good one as well to look at.
We mentioned time not being linear, also impossible spaces, which ties into the secret bookshelf kind of a thing. But it's fun when...
Well, supernaturally, too.
Yeah, like the TARDIS style. It's bigger on the inside than it looks, right?
Well, it's enough to add like a scary presence, but now not only are you doing that, you're also making your setting unreliable. Mm-hmm. So now all those normal things that you take for granted, I can go in here and I can shut the door and I'm going to be okay and this thing can't come in, right. Or I can always leave if I want to, or I know how to get back from this point to this point, and now you're actually changing the physical layout and the way that the building moves or works.
Being
to
lost
make that
inside the house
unreliable.
Is a big piece of that, like something bad happens and they're running away, and then they turn a corner and they're not where they should have been, right? And that you're playing with that.
Then you have that moment of doubt, right? So it's like, well, was I ever running the right way? Mm-hmm. Did I just get turned around?
Did I even see that?
Surely the house can't change.
Yes.
It has to be me.
Right.
And then you also have that aspect of self-doubt, that moment of, well, I know this is where it is at. And, am I going crazy?
Right.
Is this all in my head? That kind of thing.
That am I going crazy is a big piece of that. And it's something that sort of repeats itself over and over again. Am I really losing my mind right now?
And I think that can be a hard thing to grasp in a tabletop game, because everyone has sat down assuming that it's going to go terribly wrong and assuming that the house is haunted. And I think the best way to sort of pull that emotion a little bit is to involve players in individual scenes, so that they come back flustered and everybody else is still cool. So whether that's, continually poking at one person or giving each individual player kind of their own scene and moment, or building an actual instability into a character. So that's what I like about the dread system is you can kind of pull those things out with your character survey and build conflict between the characters by asking them certain questions about the others.
Off-camera action is another great way to increase tension so that something bad happens, but it's not right where the characters are.
Yeah, that I hear a crash in the other room and we run in there to see what's gone wrong.
Dead animals is always a common thing in haunted house movies. So
Or dead NPCs.
yeah, NPCs work even better. I think I would do animal first, then NPC to try and build the tension up. Maybe the dog hangs himself because he's tied up on a chain or on a leash in some really weird way where he wouldn't normally be able to do that. So it's like, what the heck? But I guess it's possible he did it. I mean, and that's a very, very common thing. Or killing NPCs when they're off camera because you got to drive those NPCs like a rental. It's a horror game. They're there to add tension and to
You can subtly
build
use
suspense.
things up to that point as well. One of my favorite things is bugs and vermin. So we all have this sort of inherent idea from wherever that when something bad is happening, the animals or the insects just seem to know about it
Right.
first. So whether it's, things are suddenly crawling away or out, or the presence of things that aren't supposed to be there. So like in The Exorcist, all of a sudden you have all of these flies.
Right.
Like, why is that happening? Where is this coming from? The whole idea of, a plague of locusts from the Bible, you have that, whatever.
Amityville Horror does a big thing with the flies all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, bugs are a big piece of this and in weird places. So not
And bugs
necessarily
weird
just in the
people out
basement.
anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. To give an example, in our Degenesis game recently, they were dealing with some pheromancers, which are able to manipulate bugs through pheromones, basically, right? And Carrie's character was sleeping, and I think your character, Lacey, was on watch, and there was a bug that crawled into her mouth. Now, the great part is you're on watch, on high alert, right? Looking around where the bad guys, these corpse eaters, going to attack from. You don't pay attention to, a trail of termites or whatever moving across, the ground, especially when it's dark and you're trying to stay hidden. And then had this moment where Carrie kind of woke up brushing her face. Oh, what was that? No, I'm not awake yet. Oh, I'll brush my face again. Something's in my mouth. And then she finally woke up with a mouthful of these kind of moist,
Creepy, crawly bugs.
squishy termite kind of things, right? And Carrie was very creeped out by it. She's just like, like they're in my mouth. I could, can taste them, and all this. And it was just a great moment. And it's something so simple. And it's not really threatening or putting the characters in danger, but then from then on, everybody's on high alert to look for trails of bugs, right? Like, is there bugs in here? Are they walking around? I'm looking for flies, or just kind of creates this paranoia.
It's a nice subtle effect for unreliability again, too, to use bugs when it comes to food. So you have great smells, beautiful looking food. You start to eat it, and then all of a sudden, this roast pig or whatever is crawling with maggots, and you realize you have a mouthful of just nasty,
Right.
rotten food.
Kind of like Back in That Time Up, right? That's another time lapse
right.
thing where you sit down to eat your meal or whatever, right? And as you eat things, oh, this is great. And then everyone realizes, maybe you look at one of the other characters as he's picking up something and he's drinking, I don't know, a glass of milk or something that spoils that way. And he sees, oh, wait, it looks like that might be curdled. And then as you raise the apple up to your mouth, take a bite, it's shrunken and dried out and brown and nasty looking. And then there's bread, like you said, with maggots in it, and there's maggots crawling on the meat and whatever. All these kind of things that you can do where it's like flashes of a different reality almost, and you're not sure which one is real. And if you can really get the characters as you're approaching your climax to be guessing which one of these things is real. Is it the decay that is the real thing that we're seeing, and we're imagining how things we would think of in a regular game, or which way is it? If you can get to that point, you've really truly inspired some madness in the characters and maybe in the players a little bit too.
And there's plenty of examples out there where it's done with the entire party. And there's also examples where it's done again to one individual person. They have this visceral reaction, and everybody else at the table is still just enjoying dinner.
Right. A big piece of this of horror movies is also flashbacks, especially if you've had a place where something bad has happened there. There's all these moments where the character walks into the room where there was the murder, and she has a flashback of the shower scene where she gets stabbed to death or whatever, right?
I think that's an okay way to do it. The other way to do it is to do it like purely investigative style,
Right.
where now we're finding clues as to what happened. Old newspaper articles,
Right.
journals, pictures, puzzles that lead you down that trail.
Now, one important thing I will say about doing flashback scenes is that I don't think that you should narrate the entire scene to the players. I think that you should have the player see themselves in the role of the person being murdered or whatever it is. And that way it's an interactive scene and not a scene of me narrating a story to you, because I think it will be scarier for the players when they are participating in the horror aspect of it, and they get to make choices about the horror scene, which draws them into it more. Because really what horror is really about is being able to see yourself as the characters that bad things are happening to, and being able to identify with them and draw that into from your personal experience, right? And being able to identify with all of that. So if you can get them to sort of take on the role of the whatever the badness was that happened, and let them make those choices in the flashback as opposed to just narrating it to them, I think it's a much more effective tool. Does that make sense?
It does. I also like the way of approaching it, like the sort of Amityville horror thing, where you're slowly driving this person crazy and you're no longer like, it starts out they're in the position of the victim, but it ends up that they're the evil murderous individual in the
Right.
end, because you've driven to that point where now everybody else has pushed them away.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this wonderful infighting and shenanigans that happens.
Now, I will say it's important to know your players, and I think at our table, especially in a one-shot sense, I don't think anybody would have any problem with one of the characters being driven to be a killer, and I think that would be really cool.
Sometimes it happens naturally at our gaming table.
True story. But I think it's important to know your players if they're going to be okay with that, because you don't want to take away their complete character agency, because there's a lot of people that have problems with that, even though it might make for a better story. But more importantly, if it's an ongoing campaign, you don't want to do that, because that will wreck that character, essentially, right? Unless the other players can prove that he was possessed and that entity is now gone from him and everyone survives, then it would be okay, I guess, But if it's an ongoing...
I feel like if everyone survives, you're doing it wrong.
Well, yeah.
This whatever game you're going to run using this advice, not everyone should survive. It should be like 1, maybe 2, or none, but never all.
All right. Now, something we haven't mentioned yet, which is really kind of a weird thing, is I was kind of looking through haunted house movies and remembering things. Sex with a ghost is a very big trope.
Oh, God.
In these haunted house movies. For whatever reason, it happens in The Shining. It happens in 13 Ghosts, I believe. It happens
in American Horror Story.
It happens in so many of them. And I'm not entirely sure.
And it's not isolated to this either. So like in the Dark Tower series, you see it with...
Roland?
No, it's not Odessa, is it? It's Susan's alter ego.
Oh.
And the... and the polter. You sort of see it with Roland too, but like she goes all out, like, I'm owning this, this thing.
Go big or go home. Right?
I was thinking of another example too, and I can't think of it now.
I mean, obviously, this is another thing that comes back to knowing your group. And if sex isn't part of your games at all, then just leave it out. But if you are accustomed to having that kind of stuff in your games, whether it's just a fade to black moment when it comes to the actual sex scene or whatever, right? You build up to it, then you fade to black like you would on the WB or whatever, right? And I think that's probably how most games kind of do it. But it is this interesting thing because it plays on whether you're losing your mind or not. Because if you wake up in bed next to a corpse when you went to sleep with a beautiful woman or man or whatever the situation is, right? How creepy is that?
There's also the whole possession aspect, right? So I don't think any of us were ever the same after watching the movie Ghost, where Patrick Swayze possesses Whoopi Goldberg, and there's a scene with Demi Moore, and I was just like, I was not prepared for that.
Right.
So again, if you have players that are willing to delve into that might be an interesting thing as well.
Right.
If you're going to do the whole ghost sex or possession, whatever, you need to make sure that there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
Other than just, I wanted a ghost to have intercourse with one of the characters. Like, there should be a higher purpose involved here.
Although I think in a lot of them, it doesn't really seem like it just sort of happens in a lot of the, you know what I mean? And it doesn't lead up to it very well in a lot of the movies, it seems like.
In American Horror Story, you have it result in basically demon baby
Yeah.
and then the birthing, and then she dies as a result. And that is why you end up with the entire family in the house to end. Then, like in the gunslinger story, it was basically her only way out of the situation they were in. Like they were stuck here by this evil entity. So she, I don't know, humps it into submission, I guess, so that they can escape.
Right on. So all these things that we've mentioned so far are bad horror elements, right? And another piece of horror is being able to have highs and lows, because it's hard to add tension if it's all horror beat, right? If you think of like story beats, right? So it's important to have moments in the story that are lighter and maybe even comedic, right? Because that's what sort of any good horror movie, I feel like they have some good laughs in it to sort of break the tension, to build it back up. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And along with that, not having everything in the game be evil. And this is really important, because one of my favorite ones that we've played recently that's a haunted house kind of game is Cur Chateau for Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And there are several things in that, lots of things in that our game are bad and terrible and are going to try and kill you. But some of them are not. And it's hard to tell which ones are not. And that is where the real rub is, because when you can go into something, into a scene, and be completely paranoid about something that is 100% innocent and couldn't harm you if it tried, but you think, and you're so caught up in this haunted house and how bad things can get that you're just absolutely paranoid about it, that's what you're going for. Those are the moments you're looking for, when you can use sort of these downbeats to build a different kind of tension, and they realize, oh, this little boy doesn't mean us any harm. And then we go into the next scene where there's something terrible that's happening, and we're back again to building the tension.
Right. And it's nice to do this with small subtleties too. So in that game, there may be 1,000 horrible sights, smells, or sounds, but there's also this ongoing smell of lilacs, which is a pleasant aroma. And, you know, while it may end up being associated with something bad or good, you don't know, but the initial reaction to that is not one of terror or disgust.
Mm-hmm. Sights, smells, and sounds is another important thing that you just mentioned there. Sights we always describe because it's how we, kind of interpret the world. But smells and sounds and even textures and how things feel are great ways to add another depth of to the world, and ways to make things creepier and more real. I know I bring it up all the time, but Veins of the Earth does a great job of this. Now, it's not exactly a horror haunted house thing, but in a lot of ways it is, because it talks about how it's always very dark, right? And darkness is a very common theme in haunted houses. And all the monsters and creatures that are in there, they all have how do they sound and how do they smell. And it's just a cool thing to think about, because there are ways to describe things and build tension with things other than you see a shadow moving or whatever, right? Like you can smell the moist, fresh tilled earth is a really great, like it has a very, very distinctive smell to it, right? And also you mentioned non-threatening smells. Now for a long time, we were involved with making actual haunted houses, right? And we went to the Midwest Haunters Convention, and they were coming out with these things that were basically the scent beads, right? But for haunted houses. And one of the people that we talked to, they used, in the main room you walked into, it was like a living room, and they had the smell of fresh apple pie in there with these beads, and then other things with there on top of it. So it was really, they said a lot of people were kind of creeped out because you had this scent, this non-threatening, welcoming scent of fresh apple pie, and then right into the the horror of this room or whatever. So just to think of ways to sort of turn those things on their heads from what people would normally expect them to be, basically. All right. The one last thing for the haunted house I think is the most important is to treat the haunted house like a character, because in these movies, the house actually is a character. There are all kinds of people that are moving around and walking through it, but the haunted house is the bad guy. It's the antagonist. So treat it
Not
like...
in all of those.
No, but in a lot of them it is. But if you're running a haunted house game, treat it like a character. Make everything about the house matter, because if you think of your character sheet, right? Well, you have a sword, and that's important to the character, and you have all these items and trappings the character has, and those are all important to him, right? Treat the house the exact same way, so that there's nothing in there just willy-nilly. It's all in there for a reason, and it all adds character to the house and adds to the atmosphere and the feel of what the house is and what everything is driving towards, the reason this haunting exists, right?
So when building a Fate game, you typically give things aspects.
Yes.
So give your haunted house some aspects. And if you want to go through and give it each room its own aspect, I think that would only aid you as well. Even if you never use it for a dice roll, it's there as a constant reminder to you as to how this room is supposed to make your players feel.
Right. And I think that will, and I know that will work for any game, whether you're actually playing Fate or you're playing D&D 5e or you're playing any game, right? You can write down these aspects because they are things to always draw yourself back to. So they are the great descriptors for when you're kind of moving the characters through the room or through the scene, things to always draw from for when things are happening. Have I incorporated this piece of the room? Have I incorporated this piece of the room? And it's easy if you had them written down as bullet points, because that way you're not reading box text, because that's terrible and it takes away from the moment and the intensity of the horror. But if you have like 4 bullet points written down for each room for what they are and what they represent and the smells and the sights and whatever, it's really easy to have those and do those in more of a in the flow improv kind of a way, so that you're not reading out of a box, because that's just terrible. It ruins the atmosphere of what's happening. So
Right. And there are a couple different ways to do, if you're doing actual ghosts within your haunted house, you can have them associated with an individual room. Or an interesting thing to do would be to have them independent of rooms, and then you can get an interesting combination. So maybe you have this welcoming room that is not scary, but it just so happens that in this encounter you have a ghost who is very malevolent and even like physically violent towards characters, or the opposite of that. You have this intensely dark and creepy room and you have a ghost NPC in there who is just sort of friendly and helpful.
The friendly, helpful ghost, I think, is a fun thing to play with, because you could very easily have it to where there's a duality to the ghost. So at some point, the ghost switches to being malevolent and then maybe switches back to being helpful. And it can be kind of a cool thing to play on, to where they see it come around the corner, and is it the good one or is it the bad one, right? One of those kind of moments.
And you can have it be helpful too, if you want. So it can go one step farther than that. And you see this a little bit like in Stranger Things, where he's not the boy. What's his name? Will. Yeah, Will is not exactly a spirit, but he's not occupying the same realm anymore. Right. So he kind of is. And so he's giving sort of helpful hints to the other characters as it's going on. And he's trying to stay hidden, and they're trying to rescue him. But at the same time, he's helping them as well.
Right on. So we've talked we've talked a lot about setting up the premise of the game and things to do throughout the game and tropes and ideas, right? One thing I think to consider is a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think when you're talking about a haunted house, there are loads of great pictures online to draw from. And so pictures. You know, big, old, dilapidated houses you can find online real easy. But more importantly, every house in every town and every neighborhood has the witch house or the whatever house in the town, right? Assuming that you're not going to get in trouble for it, from the street side, take a couple pictures of it and use it, because I think that if you use your haunted house as one of the houses that everybody in your gaming group knows, and oh man, that's the Miller house, and there was supposed to be this thing that happened there, even if your story doesn't match what actually happened to cause the urban legend, right? There's a lot of emotion and, I don't know what the right word would be, nostalgia or whatever, that people already identify with that story, that it's already a creepy house because they already know about it, right? And you can kind of draw on that and sort of piggyback off of that to even add some more intensity to it, and a little bit and even a little more horror to things.
And if you don't have that, you can just kind of research local tragedies that have happened.
Yeah, it's real easy to
Find
type
a
in.
real newspaper article to give
Mhm.
your players, that some kind of catchy headline and a short blurb about what happened at this location that's close to where they are.
Just type in your town and haunting. Something will come up. Type in your town and riot, mass murder, or tragedy, or whatever, and it will bring all kinds of stuff up. Now, just make sure that you know your players and that you're not going to be pushing on buttons that you probably shouldn't be pushing on, I guess, is the one thing to mention here. But if they are comfortable with that kind of stuff, it just adds another level of engagement with the players that's going to draw them into the story even more. All right, so we talked a lot about haunted houses, and it kind of sets things up in a very specific genre, like in the real world. Now you can play with dates and times, right? Because the Woman in Black story, that takes place in like the 1800s sometimes, right? And all these other ones, Paranormal Activity takes place within the last couple of years or whatever, whenever that came out. But what about playing the haunted house story in other genres?
I think you can do other not houses with it easily. So I think that's probably the first natural thing to talk about, right? So it doesn't actually have to be specifically a house. So in the Guillermo del Toro film, he has one that's set in the orphanage.
Oh, yeah.
With the boy. I would like to tell you what it's called, but...
It's called The Orphanage.
Is it The Orphanage?
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like we talked about this once before, and I was like, that can't possibly be the title.
There are 3 movies that are connected together.
Yeah.
Pan's Labyrinth, The Orphanage, and Devil's Backbone.
Mhm.
I got them all 3 that time. Look at me go. Right on.
So that would be a good one to use. And for me, that is an Orpheus story for sure, because I think we played something very similar to that in one of their games. You can also have it be a mental asylum. That's a nice, easy transition.
Right.
And you see that in American Horror Story in a later season. I forget one I didn't finish watching because I didn't particularly like that one. But the setting is nice. And there are other examples of that too. You can also have an apartment complex. You can have a prison, a hospital, any location where you can picture something bad like that happening. A schoolhouse could be an interesting one. So that's the easiest thing to adapt. But then you can get some further out different thematic settings as well. So you can transition this to the sci-fi realm, and you see this in the movie Alien, where they go to this abandoned spaceship and figure out what happened there, and things go tragically, terribly wrong.
If you haven't seen Alien, you've got to watch it, the very first one, because while it's a sci-fi movie, it is very much horror suspense, and it does a great, great job of it. And if you want to see how to do sci-fi horror, that's probably one of the best ones to watch, because it just does such a great job of it. And that brings in a lot of themes from like Warhammer 40K.
You see it in a lot of different, Warhammer 40K. I'm trying to think of another movie. Lost in Space does it. You can tell I don't watch that many sci-fi films, but
Right. There's a lot of them out there. I mean, we've talked about a lot of movies, and it kind of you get kind of.
Where's the one where it's got the twist at the end, but it's got is it Dennis Quaid that's in it? It starts with a P. Not Paranoia, but oh god, it was really good.
Paranorman?
No, not Pandorum.
Oh yeah.
Pandorum. It does that kind of is almost
man.
like an Amityville horror story
Yes.
set in space.
I completely forgot about that one. That one is great. If you haven't seen that one and you like to run horror games or sci-fi games, I guess, that one is a great one to watch, because it has all the horror aspects and haunted house aspects all filtered through the sci-fi lens. It's all about spaceships and space hulks and the vulnerability and isolation of being in space, which is really the exact same thing of the vulnerability and isolation of being in these haunted houses. They match up like perfectly. Like it is the exact same story, just with a different skin. It's just incredible, but it works so very well. So sci-fi, we mentioned there, very easy. Now, I think in a lot of ways, I think that you can treat dungeon crawls the exact same way. And I think that you might find that let me back up. I think that when doing most fantasy gaming, right, when you go into a dungeon, it's very straightforward. It's just sort of what you do.
If you just think back to the last D&D game you ran, stop what you're doing right now. Think about it. How much time and effort did you spend in describing the setting or the room or wherever that your people walked into? Or was it just walking down the hallway, check for traps. Now I found some goblins.
Mm-hmm.
Like, did you give it any detail as far as sight, smell, sound, feel?
Right. And this is something that I've came around to completely because of Veins of the Earth. It totally changed my mind about subterranean gaming, essentially, whether it's in a dungeon or an actual cave or a mine or any of that. I read that book and has just been completely inspired and realized I've been doing it wrong the entire time because I've been emphasizing the wrong things, right? And that'll probably be an entire episode at some point about Veins of the Earth and subterranean gaming and all the things that are just amazing from that book, right? But I think that if you apply the same logic about haunted houses, it transfers right into dungeons, right? You're isolated. There's only one or two ways in or out. So even if you wanted to get out, you could, it's not easy. You have to backtrack through the entire thing. There's danger along with that to not allow you to do that. I think it means that you have to have a better setup for the dungeon. Is it haunted? Is it locking away some evil demon or something? And a lot of times we put that stuff in there, but it's not focused on the same way you would in a haunted house story. And I think that you can add a lot of awesome elements to that game to make it creepier or better, other than you're just walking through 10 foot by 10 foot squares of hallway and room, right?
Mm-hmm.
And make
Which, by the way, why are they all flat and multi-level like somebody sank an apartment complex into the ground?
Because it's
Caves
easier
don't look
to
like
map
that.
it that way, but
Nothing looks like that.
I hate not to plug it again, but Veins solves that problem. It's just such a great, great book.
Are there any other themes or settings you specifically thought about where this works well? I feel like we've talked about Dogs in the Vineyard before.
Mm-hmm.
You could get a pretty interesting poltergeist sort of story or a Amityville horror kind of story, maybe turned on its head, incorporating that religious
Yeah, because
night story.
In Dogs in the Vineyard, for those of you that don't know, you play more or less a kind of fictionalized Mormon that is going around the countryside, and evil and demons are real. And they have the ability to sort of exorcise and hurt them with consecrated earth and prayers and stuff. And I think you're right. You could very easily do a poltergeist style game with that. However, the only thing I would say with that specifically is the way Dogs in the Vineyard is kind of structured is it's a game about hard choices and moral choices and whatnot. And I think that if you're going to do that, then you also have to incorporate that in there to make sure it kind of remains a Dogs in the Vineyard game.
Well, possession is the easiest way to do that.
Yeah. So could very easily be done. And if you're looking to have that kind of good versus evil conflict, you could very easily do that.
And that's almost a Western.
Yeah. Well, it is a Western, but I don't generally recommend it to people if they want to use it to run a Western game, because the game isn't about being a Western. The game, I said, is about these hard moral choices. And I think if you strip that away, it kind of it loses some of what it is in a way. Now, if you want to use it and it works and you guys have fun with it, more power to you, because if you're having fun, then you're doing it right and whatever, strip off whatever pieces don't work for you. But if you're looking strictly to have a Dogs in the Vineyard experience, then you need to make sure it's about hard choices and morality and all that kind of stuff. So Orpheus, we haven't mentioned it in a couple episodes. I think it's the easy go-to because it is literally ghost stories for the dead, and there are several haunted house missions that exist in it. And as you go deeper into the game, not to do too many spoilers, there are some very weird haunted house style moments that aren't exactly haunted houses, I guess, but I don't want to let that cat out of the bag. And then Hunter the Vigil, or Hunter the Reckoning, obviously, very easily goes into a haunted house kind of a thing. And at the same time, all the World of Darkness lines could do it because all of them have some kind of spiritual clan or tribe connected to them. So whether you've got a problem with Giovanni or something, or you use Giovanni to take care of a malevolent spirit that's in a house, or whether you're playing Wraith and you literally are the ghost that's possessing the house, or any of them can do it. So are there any other games that come to mind that work well for it?
I mean, there's a lot that work well for haunted house stories, but there are some that I wanted to mention. Even if you're not going to run this style of game, they are excellent for giving you ideas, and there are great things to steal from them that make them in and of themselves just worth having.
Right.
I feel like the first one is Dread.
Yeah.
It's designed for horror games. It has an excellent breakdown of different types of horror stories and how to approach them. And even if you did nothing but read it and use it as a tool to run better horror games, it would be worth your time and money. Bluebeard's Bride is a great game. I would say it's probably not for everybody, but again, it would be worth your time and money. It's a very serious personal horror game,
No,
and
I'm
I don't
just
know that
thinking
everybody
about
is
it.
prepared for that.
I don't disagree with anything that you said.
But
I'm just thinking of it in terms of it being a haunted house game, because while it isn't a haunted house game,
It is.
kind of is.
it's inside Bluebeard's house, and you're
Right.
exploring the terrible rooms, and
Right.
it is all leading up to the final.
Yeah,
showdown,
but I'm kind of like, it's
basically.
also like a personal horror story. So it's kind of an interesting blend of those two things. Very cool. Wow, that's cool. I like that
But-
game a lot.
When you read through that, it's got some excellent tables and tidbits about how to set up encounters and specific ways to challenge people in different ways. So when you're talking about, okay, so here's a way to challenge like with sexual violence, here's a way to challenge with like body violence, here's a way to just challenge, your not mental, but your like emotional nourishing side. And it kind of breaks it down for you and gives you different ways to present NPCs in order to challenge the solid aspects of your personality that you're
Right.
holding on to, which is pretty cool.
I will say, even if you don't ever play Bluebeard's Bride and you can't find a group to play it with, even if you just get the book to read it, to understand kind of the concepts you're talking about now, and it's a very different approach to horror gaming. And I will say it's an experience like I've never had in horror gaming before. And I absolutely love the game. It's a great game. It's a lot of fun. But I think it does take the right group to play it.
Yeah.
Because
And I feel the same way about A Penny for My Thoughts. And I think that is another excellent one to look at, because in that you're actually taking short tidbits of memories and feelings and emotions and sights and sounds and smells, and you're putting these little tidbits into a jar and then pulling them out and creating a story around them. So I think if you played that a couple of times, you would have a better idea how to build interesting stories around concepts like that.
Now, something you've mentioned in these is each of them have talked about, I know in Bluebeard's Bride it does, and in Dread, where it talks about asking the players, giving them some agency in what is in the room, right? What do you think is in this room? Once you've kind of described the scene that has happened and they're moving into another room or another section of the haunted house, what do you think would be in here? As so long as that they're on board with adding to the story in a meaningful way and not trying to derail it, which I
Right.
think most of your players probably should be, but asking them, like, what do you think? What would you expect to be in this room? Or what would you not expect to be in this room? What do you find scary about this room? And those kind of things. And then building on that, because then if they're being honest with you, it gives you ways to sort of twist the story and tweak it to be sort of customized for their own personal fears and things that make them uneasy.
The last one I wanted to point to, I know we talked about it a little bit already, is the Cursed Chateau. One, because it has an excellent layout of a giant house. So if
Right.
you want to run a straight up game and maybe you don't want to run Lamentations of the Flame Princess, I don't know why you wouldn't want to, but maybe you already ran this for somebody else, but now you have this book and this story. Well, it still has an excellent haunted house layout. It also has some really good tables for creating random effects, mundane sort of sounds and things of that nature that could easily be taken and used for a different game.
Right on. Not an RPG, but I think it's an easy resource because most RPG players are also tabletop gamers, like in terms of board games. And Betrayal at House on Haunted Hill
I thought about mentioning that.
is a great one because inside there, all the little tokens and cards, the way things happen in rooms and all this kind of stuff.
An actual stack of random rooms.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much there to just go through, and maybe you don't use everything that's in there, or you don't even exactly use anything that's exactly on the cards or tokens, right? But there's lots of things in there, little blurbs to spark inspiration in you and see what you might come up with. Maybe some cool combinations, maybe just draw out a couple, 3 tiles. And how can I put these together in a cool, interesting way to sort of break your ruts? Because we all have these sort of go-tos and ruts we have in storytelling, right? That's one of the things that I like about randomness sometimes is it can create combinations of things that you wouldn't have normally thought of and wouldn't normally have been your go-to because there's just things that you fall back on consistently. all the games we have downstairs. There's so many of them. Tremulous is a great one for Cthulhu-ish, Powered by the Apocalypse style games. There's some really great inspiration in there. There's some haunted house stuff that exists in that one as well.
Like Mansions of Madness is an obvious choice, but the reason I like it gave me an idea when we were running our Dread game to use a puzzle that you guys kind of put together. And I didn't end up stealing an actual puzzle from the game. I made my own, but it's cool to kind of make your players stop and use their brain a little bit and challenge them with something that isn't purely a physical challenge or an affront to their person.
Right.
And sort of like this extra tidbit that you can find along the way. Fear Itself is another really good RPG book.
Completely forgot about that. That's when I was
It's a quick read, and it really delves very deeply into the archetypes of the horror genre and the theme, and gives you some good tidbits on things to do there and different types of stories that you can tell.
I think if you want to play a actual classic haunted house story like Amityville or House on Haunted Hill or The Haunting or any of these, that's probably the one to use, because everybody in that game is a mundane person essentially, and it's designed to play as a horror movie. It's structured exactly in that way, and I think it does a very good job of it. So if you're looking for that exact experience, I think that or Dread are probably the two best ways to go. The only other thing I would mention is that Curse Chateau is a great example of it, in that when you think of haunted house gaming, you think of games like Dread or Fear Itself or Trail of Cthulhu or Call of Cthulhu, all these kind of classic horror games, right? But you don't think of games like D&D, and you don't think of games like, I mean, Lamentations you do, but it's very similar to a D&D fantasy elves and magic style game, right? And that is a great example of a 100% haunted house adventure, and it's really good. So I would encourage you that even if you don't play these horror style games, that if you involve a haunted house story in your game, that it will be all the better for it, and the change of pace might be refreshing, and you might be surprised what your players do and the experience that you get out of it, because that's a great example of incorporating just all the classic haunted house things into a more D&D style game. Now, granted, it takes place in, I think, 17th century France, but you could very easily port that adventure into any world. It would be
that's the thing about the haunted house. It's timeless.
Mm-hmm. Right on. So, do you have anything else to say about haunted houses?
Buy one, fix it up,
or don't. Definitely don't do that. That's probably bad.
Go exploring.
Right on. Yeah, haunted houses are awesome. Try them out. I think I would encourage you to try them in new ways, whether that's in a sci-fi game or in a fantasy game, talking about the underground and dungeon thing. And otherwise, haunted houses are awesome. They're just great stories, some of the best ones, some of our favorites. So add some more horror to your game and have some fun. And as always, you can find us online at justformorefix.com or on Twitter at justformorefix. You can help support us by heading over to wherever it is that you get your podcast from and giving us a rating and a comment. But the best way you can help us is by sharing us with someone that plays games or doesn't play games that you know that doesn't already listen to us, and hopefully introducing them to the world of tabletop gaming. Before we go, quick plug for another podcast on the Gonna Geek Network. The Starling Tribune has Arrow Season 6 predictions number 169. The Starling Tribune reporters Stargate pioneer Chris and Michelle preview the Arrow Season 6 and give their predictions for what will happen. The crews discuss their issues like who dies on Lian Yu? Will we see Stephen Amell shirtless in scenes this year? Will Arrow have a Season 7? Will Dina Drake, why Dina Drake is everyone's favorite Arrow character? We predict Renee and Curtis to become my two dads to Zoe. And they're looking forward to Kirk Aceveto's appearance. I'm not sure who that is. And to just see who gets in the Vigilante's way. So check that out. Their predictions for Arrow Season 6. Arrow's an awesome show. I like it. I'm not sure I'm up to Season 6. I think I'm only caught up through Season 5. So check them out. That should be a good episode. I think that'll do it for us today. Add some horror to your games. And if nothing else, we will see you guys next week. Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can find us at justonemorefix.com and follow us on Twitter at justonemorefix.